Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I request you all to please be seated? May I also request you to please keep your mobile phones in the silent mode? The Hindustan Times Media House welcomes you all to an engaging session with top policy makers and experts sharing their perspectives on green development, climate finance, and Mission LiFE, the global initiative by India to help the world in its fight against climate change and lead to a sustainable way of life to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations. We're indeed delighted to have so many of you. As we gather here, we are faced with a crucial challenge of protecting our planet and finding sustainable solutions to preserve it. The effects of climate change and environment degradation are becoming more and more apparent with each passing day, and we cannot afford to be complacent in our efforts to address these issues. I hope that today's event will provide us with a platform to engage in meaningful discussions, share valuable insights, and collaborate on ways to make a positive impact on the environment. So let us all work together to create a more sustainable and greener future for all. Once again, welcome to this meeting. We have with us this afternoon the Honorable Minister for Labour and Employment and Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Mr. Bhupendra Yadav, who will join us any minute now. With him is the Editor-in-Chief, Hindustan Times, Mr. R. Sukumar. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Minister. A warm welcome to the Honourable Minister for Labour and Employment and Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Right at the outset, I'd like to invite the Editor-in-Chief, Hindustan Times, Mr. R. Sukumar, to please make the opening remarks and welcome all our guests and speakers.
Bhupendra Yadav ji, Honorable Minister for Labour and Employment, Environment, Forest and Climate Change. His Excellency Yugo Astuto, EU Ambassador to India. Sumant Sinha, Founder, CEO and Chairman of Renewable. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, CEO, Council for Energy, Environment and Water, and Sunita Narayan, Director General, Center for Science and Environment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of several events that HT plans to do to focus on India's agenda for its G20 presidency. These are important issues. These are the kind of issues that are not part of news cycles. It's not like an election in Karnataka or an IPL match. These are sustainable issues that pretty much could decide not on the future of the country, but on the future of the world and perhaps the future of humanity itself. Just to review the 6 issues that India has listed for its agenda for the G20 presidency are green development, climate finance, and LiFE, accelerated, inclusive, and resilient growth, progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, technological transformation and digital public infrastructure, multilateral institutions for the 21st century, and women-led and women-centric development. Each of these is a critical issue. Let's take today's topic for instance. We are here to talk about green development, climate finance, and LiFE. As some of you may have seen in today's paper, there is now an increased chance, a 66% chance, that we will cross the 1.5 degree Celsius warming threshold over pre-industrial levels in the next 5 years. At one point in time, no one thought that this would happen before 2040 or 2050. And now we are told it could happen in the next 5 years. And then, because we will keep moving forward, we'll move towards 2 degrees. The impact of these changes will be catastrophic. Yet, any effort to tackle this needs to be equitable. The global south cannot be asked to do this at the cost of development, especially not by the global north, which is responsible for historical emissions, which is why green development and climate finance are important. They are complex issues. They are the issues that have repeatedly thrown a spanner in the works during global climate conferences, but we are hoping that during its presidency, India will be able to make some headway on this. But it isn't just countries and corporations that have a role to play. So do individuals. That's what makes lifestyle for environment, a term coined by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, especially relevant. Can we all adopt lifestyles and make choices that acknowledge the shadow looming over all of humanity? We shall be hearing from the minister and from a very distinguished set of panelists on this. At HT, we believe that this is among the most important issues facing all of us. One reason why we cover the environment as intensively as we do. So I'd like to end with a short plug. Please do read Hindustan Times. You will get to learn more about the environment and about the threats that all of us really face. Thank you again for making it here on a sunny May afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sukumar. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker is the Union Minister for Labour and Employment and Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and is responsible for formulating policies and implementing programs to protect the environment, conserve our forests, and mitigate climate change. Under his leadership, the ministry has implemented several policies and initiatives aimed at promoting sustainable development and protecting the environment. He has been actively involved in various national and international fora to promote environmental conservation and climate action. His vision and dedication to creating a greener and cleaner India have made him a respected figure in the country's political and environmental spheres. Mr. Bhupendra Yadav is considered to be a key figure in India's efforts towards achieving a greener and more sustainable future. May I request the Honourable Minister to please give the keynote address.
On the dais, Shri Sukumar ji, the distinguished panelists of today's further discussion, Sunita ji, Arunabh ji, ladies and gentlemen, namaste and very good afternoon to all of you. I am happy to be present here today at the Hindustan Times G20 agenda. I am also eager to share with this, gathering my ideas and thought on a range of issues concerning sustainable development, a green India, mission life, and climate finance. Because all these ideas concern the future of the planet we call home, and the planet we will leave behind for our children. Talking about climate change or climate action, therefore it is not just tokenism. The climate talk we deliver and the climate action we initiate will decide the quality of life that our children will have tomorrow. So, I would like to congratulate the Hindustan Times Media Group for creating this platform today to discuss areas concerning climate change. Nature has blessed us with riches. Everything nature gives us in a beautiful and useful. But what we are giving back to nature is pure garbage and harmful. A man began making technological advancement. A false notion was created that human being is supreme. The anthropocentric outlook saw man as the different from the nature, when the fact is that we are one with nature. The global community together is today emitting over 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 annually. The mindless consumption pattern is largely responsible for alarming level of emission. With more than 17% of global population, India has contributed only about 4% of global cumulative greenhouse gas emission between 1850 and 2019. Africa, with 54 countries, accounts for only about 3% of global emission. Against this, 60% emissions have been contributed by developed nations. There is a lot of talk in the world on how emissions are getting added to environment. So let me tell you of a way to cut down on these emissions. Friends, according to the United Nations Environment Program, if 1 billion people out of the global population of over 8 billion adopt environment-friendly behaviors in their daily lives, global carbon emission could drop by about 20%. In India, Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji has ensured we begin the work on cutting down emission at all levels from industry to individual. I'm sure all of you have heard about Mission LiFE, Lifestyle for Environment. Is a mantra the Honorable PM given to reduce emissions at all level of the individual, meaning you and I. Often the simplest thing is the most difficult to notice. Switching off the AC and light while leaving room is something most of us ignore. Turning the tap off while brushing is again something many of us forget. But inculcating simple habits like there can go a long way in ensuring a greener tomorrow, because simple is sustainable. As the World Environment Day approaches, all ministries and departments of the Government of India are working to raise awareness and action at the level of the individual. India is working on mission mode currently to bring together millions of people on June 5th to join Mission LiFE by making choice that develop on environmental sense in us, moving beyond a civic sense. I urge all of you to join the Meri Life app, that is a portal started by our ministry, and start making pro-planet choices and be part of the noble mission. The report of the IPCC Working Group 3 says, having the right policies, infrastructure and technology in place to enable change to our lifestyle and behavior can result in 40 to 70% reduction in greenhouse emissions by 2050. So talking of switching off lights and turning off taps may have sounded as a meaningless actions, but I hope I have been able to convince at least this gathering about its importance. I would therefore like to use this platform to urge all of you, and with media, to the people also, to be a part of this initiative. Friends, while a huge impact can be made to climate action through the adoption of lifestyle for environment, governments are required to provide the right policies, infrastructure, and technology to create an enabling environment to fight climate change. I would like to draw the attention of this gathering now to what is the likely cost of creating this enabling environment. There are several estimates of resources required for climate action to meet net zero targets set down by countries. It is estimated that $4 trillion per year needs to be invested in renewable energy up until 2030 to be able to reach the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. An investment of at least $4 to $6 trillion per year will be needed for a global transformation of a low carbon economy. The world reached an agreement that it is the Western model of reckless development which caused irreparable damage to the environment. With advancement in technology, the countries of the West come to believe that human gratification was the ultimate aim. They begin to see everything as subservient to human beings. This led to a development model which raised natural resources and added toxins to the environment. The cost of this model of development is today being paid not just by all human beings, but the world over, all the life forms also. This has happened because in nature everything is connected. Connecting with nature is thus actually connecting with one's own self. If all bees in the world were to disappear, your cup of coffee would become rare. It will also become costlier. It is so because coffee flower is only open for pollination for 3 or 4 days. If no insect is available to help pollination, cultivation would suffer. Many of you might already be familiar with this fact, but it is important to remind ourselves of this now more than ever, that we are one with nature. In India, we have always believed, पौधे में भी परमात्मा होता है. God dwells in all living beings and forms. The West is coming to this realization now with the philosophy of deep ecology, gaining currency. I will say better late than never, because the climate action cannot achieve meaningful results without the basic understanding of our real connection with nature. Once we have this understanding, we realize conservation cannot be devoid of compassion. Climate action will also find it difficult to move ahead without adequate climate finance. For now, the international community is divided over the definition of climate finance. This has created an ambiguity in both the funding of climate projects and determining of the amount required for it. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has operationalized only a working definition so far. Climate finance is generally known as a financial flow mobilized by industrialized countries, governments, and private entities that support climate change mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. This means that funds allocated by national government for energy, climate transition activities would not be counted as climate finance. Historically, mitigation finance has accounted for a larger share of climate finance as compared to adaptation finance. While there is a persistent gap between adaptation and mitigation finance, the silver lining is that it has been steadily narrowing since 2016. In 2020, mitigation finance was 1.69 times of adaptation finance as compared to 2016, when mitigation finance was 4.1 times of adaptation finance. The UNEP Adaptation Gap Report 2021 suggests that annual adaptation cost in developing countries could reach somewhere between $155 to $330 billion by 2030. The report has noted that for many countries, adaptation and mitigation finance was largely being funded by domestic public finance as compared to international sources. For instance, in August 2022, analysis of India's adaptation funding found that 94% of it was done by domestic public finance, which included central and state government budgets. India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, is a confident nation filled with a can-do approach. We are not waiting for the world to rescue us. We are, in fact, working to pull ourselves out of this crisis through domestic efforts and also helping the global south by leading alliances such as Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure and Infrastructure for Resilient Island States to ensure no one is left behind. This approach also reflects in India's G20 presidency, which adopted the theme of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, one earth, one world, one future. Working on a consensus-driven approach, India plans to ensure the world emerge from this crisis together and stronger. Under India's presidency, the G20 member countries have reaffirmed their commitment toward combating the environment and climate crisis with a renewed sense of urgency. On the domestic front, India's climate action have so far been largely financed from domestic resources. However, providing new and additional financial resources as well as transfer of technology to address the global climate change are among the commitments and responsibilities of the developed countries under UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. India will also require its due share from such international financial resources and technological support. It was the developed countries who agreed to the $100 billion fund for the developing countries, and the same has not been delivered till date. Developing countries like India are entitled to receive these funds for the mitigation and adaptation programs and for capacity building to combat climate change. The vagaries of climate change today are impacting the developing world more. This has raised the risk of many nations being pushed into acute poverty and major food and water crisis. While the world acknowledges that poverty anywhere is a threat to peace and security everywhere, the required action to prevent this poverty is missing. In a remarkable development, at COP27 held in Egypt, the world agreed to establish a new funding arrangement as well as a dedicated fund to assist developing countries for loss and damages. India, as the voice of Global South, had been a vocal supporter of this loss and damages fund. So India does consider to creation of dedicated fund a remarkably important development. But India is also concerned over the future of this fund, its past experience, and urge the global community to act on it. At COP27 itself, while the loss and damage funding arrangement was agreed upon, serious concerns were expressed that the goal of developed countries parties to mobilize jointly $100 billion by 2020 has not yet been met. For more than a decade, the ambiguous language in developed countries' climate finance commitment for adaptation and mitigation has been called out. This includes debates about what counts as climate finance, the fair share of climate finance from diverse provider countries. Yet forward-looking deliberations are undermined by recent history. The developed world has fallen short of honoring its commitment to the climate finance. Friends, the good news is that we in India have continued to make effort to combat climate change at our own level. Environment conservation is the front and center of all policy formulations today in India. Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji has outlined that in India, environment conservation and development are not at cross purposes but work together. If you look at the budget 2023 and 24, the Saptarishi or 7 priority areas include green growth. The aggressive policies of India toward rapid development of renewables and robust framework for energy efficiency programs have shown considerable impact by the policy of our government. India has been ranked among top 5 countries in the world and the best among the G20 countries based on its climate action performance. I am tempted to say that we have come so far without the promised climate finance. When it comes to India's commitment toward net zero emission by 2070, we are walking the talk. At COP26, Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji declared Panchamrit, a 5-fold strategy to achieve this fate. These 5 points include: first, India will gets its non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatt by 2030. Second, India will meet 50% of its energy requirement from renewable energy by 2030. Third, India will reduce the total projected carbon emission by 1 billion tons from now onward till 2030. Fourth, by 2030, India will reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by less than 45%. Fifth, so by the year 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero. In August 2022, India became one of the few countries to communicate its updated nationally determined contribution to United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change. India now stands committed to reduce emission intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030. From being a power deficit nation at the time of independence, the effort of Make India energy independent gained momentum in 2014. Today, we are a power surplus nation with a total installed capacity of over 4 lakh megawatt. Keeping in mind SDGs, India power generation mix is rapidly shifting toward a more significant share of renewable energy. India has already installed 172.45 gigawatt to renewable energy and is the only country among G20 nations that is progressing rapidly to meet its climate goal. India's annual renewable energy addition has been exceeding that of coal-based thermal power since 2017, and in the last 9 years, India's installed renewable energy capacity has increased by 2.5 times, and the solar energy capacity has increased by 25 times. India is thus likely to achieve its second NDC well ahead of schedule. The budget 2023-24 also made an allocation of rupees 19,700 crore to the National Green Hydrogen Mission as a step towards a decarbonization pathway. Simultaneously, India's forest cover has grown significantly. The total forest and tree cover of the country is 80.9 million hectares, which is 24.62% of the geographical area of India. As compared to the assessment of 2019, there has been an increase of 2,261 square kilometers in the total forest and tree cover. India is ready to support the global efforts to protect at least 30% of biodiversity-rich land and water areas by 2030, which is the target set under the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed upon the UN Biodiversity Summit. The population of lion, tiger, leopard, and elephant has grown. India has launched the Big Cat Alliance for protection of big cats across the world. India is working with whole of government approach and at all level of society, the individual, the community, and the government to protect the environment. Because protecting the environment is an act of faith for India, not just a lip service. Ladies and gentlemen, I have spoken at length today, and you all have heard me patiently. I am thankful for that. I am also thankful to Hindustan Times for having me at this event. I wish your organization on the very best in contributing to the mission of environment protection. Thank you once again. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister Sir, for your informative and very inspiring address. We will now follow on to panel discussion after. Thank you so much, sir, for having spared the time to be with us. Ladies and gentlemen, we're moving on to our panel now. If I could request our esteemed speakers to please come up on stage. We've got the Ambassador of the Delegation of the EU to India and Bhutan, Mr. Ugo Astuto, Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, Ms. Sunita Narayan, and our moderator, Jayashree, to please come up on stage. Mr. Suman Sinha will join us very soon. I'll just quickly introduce our speakers so that then Jayashree can just go straight into the discussion. We've got Mr. Ugo Astuto, the distinguished diplomat and the ambassador of the delegation of the EU to India and Bhutan. With his extensive experience in the field of international relations, he has been a driving force in strengthening the EU's relations with India and Bhutan, promoting trade, investment, and cultural ties between the two regions. His role involves overseeing the EU's cooperation with India and Bhutan on a range of issues, including political, economic, and environmental matters. He's also been actively involved in various initiatives aimed at enhancing regional stability and addressing global challenges such as climate change and counter-terrorism. His vision and leadership have made him a respected figure in the diplomatic circles of both India and Bhutan. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, renowned economist and thought leader in the field of energy and environmental policy, founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW, a leading think tank in India that specializes in research and analysis on energy, climate change, and sustainable development. Dr. Ghosh is a globally recognized expert on energy and environmental policy, and his work has been widely published in academic journals, policy reports, and mainstream media. He's advised several governments and international organizations on energy and environmental policy and has served as a member of numerous expert committees and task forces in India and globally. Dr. Ghosh is also a professor of energy and environment at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland in the US, and an adjunct faculty at several other universities. We also have with us Ms. Sunita Narayan, whose tireless efforts and commitment to environmental causes have made her a respected figure in India's environmental movement and an inspiration to many. A leading environmentalist, writer, and activist, Ms. Narayan has been at the forefront of the country's environmental movement for several decades. She's the Director General of the Center for Science and Environment, CSE, a New Delhi-based research and advocacy organization that specializes in environmental and public health issues and has been a vocal advocate for sustainable development, climate action, and environmental justice in India and globally. To moderate this discussion, we've got Ms. Jayashree Nandi, Environment and Climate Correspondent at Hindustan Times. She covers climate science and UN climate negotiations, weather, environmental policy, air and water pollution, forests, wildlife, environmental litigation, and people's stories for steering this discussion. So I'll introduce Mr. Sumant Sinha as soon as he arrives. Jayashree, it's over to you now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time for this important panel discussion. Climate science is one thing, but climate politics is even more complex. And we hope to get a very nuanced understanding from you. Many of my colleagues are here today, and we are still trying to, understand climate politics and the games behind it. So I will start with a common question and seek your comments on a common issue to begin with. And then I'll ask you questions individually based on your experiences. And then we'll have closing comments from you. So today we are at a critical time when the average global temperature is expected to rise by 1.5 degree over pre-industrial levels in the next 5 years, according to WMO. And also the global stock take is scheduled for later this year, which is going to be basically to see whether we are meeting the Paris Agreement goals or not. And we know for sure that we are probably far off when it comes to that. Also, we know that the G20 countries are responsible for 70 to 80% of emissions. So what are your expectations from the G20? How do you think the G20 can make a difference? Can we start with you, Ambassador?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Hindustan Times for organizing this event and inviting me. Well, what you said is spot on. We have all read in newspapers today that we may actually reach the 1.5 degrees increase in temperature much earlier than expected. We have all read the IPCC report, which was a very sobering reading about the fact that even if all the commitments taken in Paris were to be fully implemented, we are not entirely sure to be able to respect this 1.5 target. And we all see with our own eyes the already severe consequences of global warming. We see extreme weather events. No continent is spared, be it South Asia or Europe. As we speak, my own native country in Italy is experiencing floods. I can tell you in May it's extremely unusual. So I think we all agree at this point that the urgency is there. We need to cut emissions. We need to cut drastically emissions, while at the same time not leaving behind adaptation. That was the message that the European Union has been trying to convey at the last COP, and we worked together with India on that. I believe it's absolutely indispensable that the international community collectively focuses even more on the need to cut emissions. And in order to do so, well, we know that there is no silver bullet, but a number of measures to be taken. We need to save energy. Energy efficiency is very important. We need to accelerate the transition towards a greener energy mix. We need to make the distribution of electricity more efficient. We need to stimulate market. The investment cannot be just coming from governments. We need to have the public sector intervening massively. And we need to leave no one behind, meaning that we need to help the most vulnerable countries in the international community, and we must facilitate the transfer of capital as necessary. The G20 in all this can be instrumental, because as you said, collectively the G20 is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. So it has a particular responsibility. It's a forum where decision can be taken, where the collective agenda can be shaped. So I think the G20 at this moment has a responsibility to fulfill. Thank you.
Arunabha, can we?
The G20 was forged in crisis. In the late 1990s, there was a financial crisis, which resulted in the formation of the G20, which was led at that time by finance ministers and central bank governors. 10 years later, there was another crisis, the global financial crisis, which resulted in the G20 getting the political dimension. So the Sherpa track emerged. We are in the middle of another financial crisis right now, actually, in the world, with many emerging markets and developing countries under the burden of debt, and the deceleration in SDGs. Now, against that backdrop, what can we expect from the G20 with regards to green development and climate action? It is the number one thing that we hope, is that the G20 recognizes that climate change is not an environmental issue alone. That it is at the heart of a far bigger existential crisis that is going to impact our economic prospects, human development, the resilience of our natural ecosystems, and of course, the prospects for future generations. Now, if we internalize that message, in part delivered by the WMO this week alone, then operationally, what is it that it can do? And the G20 operates in these two different tracks, the Sherpa track and the finance track. And number one priority should be that the two tracks talk to each other and cohere in terms of what they deliver on climate action. What I mean by this is, say in the Sherpa track, we have something called the Environmental, Climate and Sustainability Working Group. We also have something called the Energy Transition Working Group. This year, India is introducing a disaster risk reduction working group. Yeah. So from all of this, you're seeing that from the political leaders' side, there is clearly an emphasis that the actions that we outline, whether it is in investing more in renewable energy infrastructure, whether it is now diversifying renewable energy supply chains, access to critical minerals that go into clean energy infrastructure, and then, of course, the whole focus on sustainable consumption through lifestyle for environment and triggering a circular economy. These are all elements that are formally there in the G20 agenda. But then, on the other side is the finance track. And the finance track also has certain working groups that have to respond to this demand. So there is, number one, a sustainable finance working group, right, which has to now figure out how do we get what Minister Yadav said, the $4 trillion on the table, which is not just for climate action, but as our priority for G20 says, accelerating progress on SDGs overall. Yes. But then there are two other working groups that are also absolutely critical. One is called the Framework Working Group, which looks at the entire sort of macroeconomy, global macroeconomy. And that's where the indebtedness of developing countries is of particular concern, that when you are deeply indebted, when various types of shocks have reduced your fiscal space, how will you find the resources to then invest in climate? And therefore comes the other important working group, which is the International Financial Architecture Working Group, which will then look at the reform of the multilateral development banks. Because unless that reform happens, then a lot of the public capital that could be leveraged to bring in private capital does not happen. So I've given a very kind of perhaps a dry answer, but you know, the G20 is the forum where these nuts and bolts have to be worked out. The rest is rhetoric.
Yeah. Sure. Sunita, give us your views and also how important, if you could also talk about how important that communique would be. And
so I think from all you've heard, it's very important that G20 is a very important forum to discuss this. Now for me, the clock is ticking. We're already in May. The communique is not very far away in September, so the paper and the working has to be, I'm sure, as good diplomats, Ambassador will tell us that all the work has to be finished quite a few months before. So, to me, why is G20 important? Firstly, G20 is important because unlike G7, it has countries with differentiation in it. So whereas when G7 speaks about climate issues, it is really about rich countries, and those are countries with the highest historical emissions. Those are countries which have to take the lead when it comes to mitigation, and they should have the toughest targets in front of them. But G20 is a forum which has both the richest and the most, the biggest historical and the current largest polluters. It also has emerging countries. Countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa. These are countries which will have a different trajectory when it comes to emission control. Now, what I think G20 therefore needs to do, and this is a very important moment, we've had the Indonesian presidentship, we now have India, moving to South Africa, and then, no, Brazil, and then Brazil now after this. I think it's a very important time for us, for the Indian government, in this communique, to make sure that the issue of climate action is given the highest priority. Mitigation targets are given the highest priority. And with that, the issue of equity and differentiation is also embedded. And I think this is an opportunity we must not miss, because this is going to be very important for the future when it comes to issues of the just energy transition, the question about mitigation between countries and the pathway ahead. G20 is the opportunity to put forward a very clear statement that we take the issue of climate change very seriously. We do take the issue of mitigation very seriously. We also find that we are not doing enough. We are not walking the talk. We do not see countries on track even now to meet their 2030 targets. Perhaps they will catch up. The US with this IRA and the EU with a fairly controversial CBAM, which is another issue that needs to be discussed. They may catch up, but as yet we don't see the evidence. We see more oil and gas drilling happening in the world. We see more dependence on fossil fuel from the countries who really should have moved out of fossil fuel by now. So I think it's important for G20 under the leadership of India to make sure that there is very clear statements about both the need for action and the need for equity and climate justice. Because without that, you will not get an effective, ambitious climate agreement for the future. So I think this is, and we've never seen this before. Let's be clear about this, Jayashree. We've had a lot of talk about climate change, but even now in the Paris Agreement, it says climate justice is important for some. That's what the preamble of the Paris Agreement says. I think for India, the most important issue as a voice for the South is to make sure that not only is there high ambition, but that high ambition goes with the issue of climate justice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a related question for Ambassador. Every time we report from COPs or we are reporting in general on climate politics, we report on how the trust between developed and developing nations is eroding, and the lack of trust is deepening with every UNFCCC meeting. One of the issues is climate finance, and the minister spoke at length about it, how there is not enough finance from developed countries coming through, not finance for adaptation. How do you think this issue will finally be addressed and trust restored? And also, how do we make sure that the finance that is coming is not in the form of loans alone? I mean, our indebtedness is going up, like Arunabha was saying, so what is the solution for this?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think I agree that we need to build trust. And I think the European Union has demonstrated its commitment in this respect at the last COP, where you may remember until the last few days, the controversy was, should we create or shouldn't we create a loss and damage fund? Yes. And then the European Union clearly came out in favor of the creation of a loss and damage fund, together, working together with India for a positive conclusion of the conference of the party. So I think that's evidence of the fact that we understand and we are trying to work so that this trust can be established. We need climate action. We also need that no one is left behind. The European Union today is already the largest provider of public funds when it comes to climate. It's also the first provider worldwide of development aid. When it comes to the famous target of the $1 billion, we have walked the talk. We have provided more than our fair share. So we believe that we have a good record in that respect. And we are very happy to work together with the rest of the international community to do more. In any case, I think we all realize that public funds alone are not sufficient. What Dr. Ghosh was saying earlier is very true. Clearly, we also have to review the functioning of international finance institutions so that they can address the current emergency. But also, beside IFIs, we need to mobilize private capital. We need to create a legislative framework domestically in each and every one of our countries and then internationally so that we can channel funds, private funds, easily towards the green transition. So in a nutshell, once again, it's not about one single measure, it's about taking a holistic view of the problem and putting together the various pieces of the puzzle. Maybe one clarification, we will reach our target, but it's not about CBAM, it's about the Fit for 55 vision, which means that we are going to reduce by 55% our carbon emission by 2030. It's enshrined in law now, so it's not just a vague aspiration, it's a legal prescription for EU member states.
So Arunabha, the loss and damage issue, which Ambassador also mentioned, and loss and damage fund had grabbed the headlines this year after COP. But many of us do not understand how is this fund going to benefit countries like India? Is it going to benefit at all? And also, what are the various modalities being worked out? How will you actually compensate countries for losses due to climate?
Loss and damage has been on the agenda for a very long time. And what we got in Sharm el-Sheikh was, as Ambassador Sudhir just said, the agreement that the facility will be created. Now, there is a committee that has been now created to design it, right? Which means, number one, it has to decide how will it get capitalized. Secondly, how will you distribute and who gets it. To answer your question, I think one of the things we have to be very clear about is making sure that just because we are big, that does not mean small is vulnerable and the big is emerging economy. There are many parts of India and many parts of many other large economies that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. Our entire agriculture sector, when we think about this 1.5 degrees increase over the next 5 years, we have to think about not just global surface temperature on average. We have to ask ourselves what is the appropriate range within which the wheat crop grows or dies. What results in early maturing of the crop and therefore lower yield. What results in lower output from cattle in terms of milk. All of that then impacts. So then what seems like just temperature rise has compounding effects across various sectors of the economy. So we have to make sure that the loss and damage financing facility accounts for a way of understanding vulnerability rather than excluding an entire set of countries from it and just saying, okay, if you're a small island state, then you get the money and not. That raises the second question of, how do you finance this? And this is something that we need to start thinking about quite innovatively. In fact, in addition to the G20, there is also the financing summit that President Macron is hosting next month. And again, India is co-chairing the steering committee for the summit. And one of the things we are exploring in that is how do we consider innovative financing mechanisms that can raise a lot more capital, particularly to address the vulnerability issue. Because while mitigation financing can get a lot more of the private sector investment, you'll probably hear from Sumant, how to get more private sector investment. But adaptation and particularly resilience will require some innovative thinking. Now, what those solutions are, will that be, the production of fossil fuels? Will that be the maritime sector? Will it be the aviation sector? Will it be financial transactions? There are all sorts of options on the table that we have to consider. Only then we will get a loss and damage financing facility that is sort of fit for purpose. But one last thing I should say is that we also have to design an insurance cushion. So loss and damage suggests that once you're lost and once you're damaged, then something will pay up. But you need an insurance cushion that gives you the bulwark to fall back onto when the compounding climate shocks emerge.
Sunita, I wanted to ask you a slightly controversial question. Two of the most sensitive issues that we see every year at COPs is coal. I wanted to understand how do you address the issue of fossil fuels without addressing all fossil fuels? And this has been a touchy subject at the COPs. Reconsidering who would be the donors for loss and damage, for climate finance, and even emerging economies should contribute is what the developed countries have said. What are your thoughts on these issues, if you could share some?
Definitely, Jayashree, and I know why you ask me controversial questions. Let me start with the second one first, because taking forward the issue of loss and damage. So when the Loss and Damage Fund was created, frankly, it's not a new idea. So let's be clear, it's been on the table since almost the first COP, when AOSIS put the issue of loss and damage on the table. So it's not a new idea. What we got in Sharm el-Sheikh is really nothing but a piece of paper. Hopefully now we will work out the details and come up with more flesh on the idea, including the ways of funding it. Now the question that has, the two questions that are obviously the biggest questions is three. One is, who should pay for it, which is what you're asking me. Should India pay for it as well? Now, our position has been absolutely no. And the reason is, and I think this is where we go back to the root of the problem with climate negotiations. Climate negotiations are global negotiations. They need to be based on rules. They should not be based on the whims and fancies of countries and on the ability of big countries to bully small countries. They need to be based on rules. Now, this is where the Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we draw the first inspiration or the rule from, in 1992 was based on the framing that said, there is a group of countries which have created the problem. They need to reduce. The remaining world will also add to emissions as they grow. They need the right to development, but they must develop differently. And for that, we need finance and technology as enablers so that they can actually grow, but they can grow without pollution. And that was the framing of the first convention. The Kyoto Protocol, which came from the convention, followed through the same rules to say, here is a group of countries, these are the rules, this is the compliance mechanism, the deterrence needs to be strengthened, but essentially asked countries to come up with emission reduction targets based on what they had contributed to the stock of emissions in the atmosphere. Now, after that, the world gave up. We essentially decided, because the US would never sign a rule-based international agreement, the world decided, no, let's come up with an agreement in which everybody is going to do whatever best they can, and we will try and make sure somewhere the rule of equity is kept at the back of our mind, but it's not as part of the principle of the pledge. So it's a pledge system. I pledge to reduce 50% by 2030. I pledge to reduce 30%. Now what this has meant is, firstly, according to UNFCCC itself, even if all countries were to meet the pledges and even the enhanced NDCs, we will not stay below the 1.5 degrees centigrade, which means we're way off track. The other is that the pledges themselves are extremely inequitable. And thirdly comes the problem of loss and damage. Why India has not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, either in the past or even up to 2030, it should not be part of the conversation, but it's a distraction. It is used to essentially delay and to create a divide between the rich, the poor, and the even poorer countries, between the vulnerable and the even more vulnerable countries. We are sitting and deciding now who is more vulnerable. How is India not vulnerable with its vast coastline, with its large numbers of very poor people who are dependent on the very variable monsoon today? How is Bangladesh more vulnerable? Why are we making India fight Bangladesh? But that's essentially the framing of the global negotiation, which is today extremely distracting. It delays action, and it actually makes sure that we do not move towards what I think is needed, a very ambitious, a very urgently needed emission reduction targets by countries. So that's why the loss and damage issue, to me, Jayashree, needs to go back to the root to discuss the issue of accountability, of responsibility. Coal, very quickly, because I know Sumant hasn't had a chance to speak yet. The issue of coal. I think coal has again been one of those issues which essentially, today let's look at the facts. The part of the world which has contributed most to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere used coal to build up the stock in the atmosphere. But they have moved out of coal today to what they consider relatively cleaner sources, which is gas in most cases, nuclear in limited spaces, and in some countries like Germany, renewables. But more or less, it's still gas. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all this Russia-Ukraine issue becoming such a hot potato. Gas is at the center of energy security even today. Now, this overemphasis on coal, which is also a fossil fuel, as much as gas, essentially means that 70% of the world, which has not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gases, which is least capable of moving out of its current energy security, which is based on coal, the onus of change is put on them. Now, this is where, to me, the question of just energy transition partnerships needs to be changed so that you move out of the emphasis on removal of coal or phase out of coal to the question of phasing in of renewable energy. Right. Okay? You need to move towards looking at gas and coal together, and you need to look at the fact that we need gas today because for us, local air pollution means that we need to move towards gas. Delhi has banned the use of coal. We have banned the use of coal in a 100-kilometer radius around Delhi because of local air pollution. We want industry to move towards gas, but the gas prices are so high today, largely because of the fact that today all the gas in the world is moving towards more paying customers, and we are not one of them.
Sure. Thank you, Sunita. Yeah, so she was talking about renewable energy goals, and now we are expecting at COP28 there will be some decision on having a new global renewable energy goal. India's total installed power generation capacity has reached 460 gigawatts, of which nearly 40% is from non-fossil sources. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Sinha, How do you think India will achieve its NDC, updated NDC goal of having 50% power capacity from non-fossil sources? How easy is it? Are we going to achieve it in advance? And can we achieve more than that?
You know, in terms of meeting the target of 50% non-fossil fuel capacity or fossil fuel capacity, whichever way you want to cut it, I think it's going to be achieved because, as you said, we're already at 40% right now. So I think getting to 50% just means that if we just add the next 50, 60 gigawatts out of renewable energy, then essentially you're already there.
The reason it's gone off is because I think, Jayashree, you need to ask him not about capacity, but about generation.
No, you're absolutely right. So the thing is that, as I said, we'll get there in 2-3 years. But I don't think that's really the nub of the problem, as Sunita has already now said. The issue is, obviously, what is the target we are setting for? What percentage of our total power consumption essentially comes from renewable energy or non-fossil fuel energy? And that is, if you just extrapolate the 50% in 2030, it comes to about 30% of total energy consumption. And I think that is the target that can potentially be exceeded because I think we can do more and we will do more. But I think, you know, now, so there are two issues that I want to just bring up. Number one is that adding capacity in renewables is not that straightforward. Okay, we all just assume, you know, let's phase down coal and fossil fuels and let's phase up, as Sunita was saying, phase in renewables. But there are certain execution issues that we're dealing with, which are things that are going to prevent us from going at a much faster pace, and we have to be cognizant of that. So I think from a government standpoint, and I'm sympathetic to their views, that you have to manage this transition very carefully. Because if we phase out fossil fuels too rapidly, and renewables haven't been able to phase in fast enough, then you're going to have a fundamental problem. So I think that whole transition has to be managed very carefully. So I think that is point number one. And within that, there are multiple issues involved. There are issues around land, transmission build out, equipment supply, whether you want to be dependent on other parts of the world to get all your equipment, you know, enough people being trained and so on. So there are practical, real life issues that also have to be considered. So that's one aspect of it, which is how rapidly can you ramp up renewables. But there's a second aspect to this, which is that, you know, and I'll just go back and say that our company's name has now been changed. We are no longer Renew Power. We are now Renew, only Renew. And the reason is that, you know, just looking at decarbonizing only the power sector is not enough because electricity accounts for only 25% of all energy consumption, right? And energy itself accounts for 75% of all fossil fuel emissions. So electricity by itself accounts for only 20% of all carbon emissions, which is very little. Now, to me, whether we implement renewables faster or slower, somehow we'll get it done at some point. Maybe it takes 5 years more or less, but we'll get it done. Then the question is, okay, you know, the power sector is sorted, but what about the balance 3/4 of the energy system? And I think companies like us are now increasingly realizing that that's really where the battle has to be fought next. And the good news there is that technologies are now becoming available that will allow us to start decarbonizing the rest of the energy spectrum as well. And those are very exciting new developing areas, which are moving very fast. And the EU, in fact, is taking the lead in trying to encourage some of these things at a global level. But if you ask me, I'm a little bit also in Sunita's camp that a lot of these things are moving more slowly than they should. They need to move a lot faster. And that is really where countries need to do more. I think if at COP28 we're able to set a global renewables target, I think that would be terrific. But I equally think we need to set a global carbon price as well. And this carbon price should not be limited within geographies, which is what it is right now. For example, the European Union has the ETS scheme, right, which is only applicable for certain geographies, not applicable for India. So if I generate a carbon credit here, by reducing carbon emissions here, I cannot sell that into the European Union scheme, right? So we need to make that a lot more fungible. So the whole world needs to move to the same carbon system. I think all of that will allow us then to reduce carbon emissions faster than the trajectory that we're on right now. And maybe by 2050, 2040, 2060, whatever be that deadline or that date, we'll end up getting there. Because I think now there's enough momentum, there's enough technology developments, but I think the policy push is still a little bit weak and still needs to be bolstered. I think to Arunabha's point around resilience and adaptation, I think Mitigation is moving at a certain pace, right, which I said is good enough, but it has to do faster. And so therefore adaptation and resilience are going to become much more important as part of this whole climate change and just transition conversation. And I think you'll start seeing a lot more of the conversation moving in that direction now.
Sure.
As well.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha. So now time for closing comments, and I'm going to ask you whether globally we are leaving too much to technological fixes like carbon capture, sequestration, considering that we are going to breach the 1.5 degree threshold at least temporarily in the next 5 years. Do we have time to rely on such technologies? What are your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, again, I think there is no silver bullet, but clearly we need to act fast. So now we need to focus on the reduction of emissions, on the transition to a greener energy mix. Carbon capture and storage can be part of the solution, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. But if you permit me, I will address one point. If the conflict in Ukraine is such a hot potato, it's not because of gas, but because a pretty big country, which also happens to be a member of the Security Council, Russia, invaded its neighbor, its peaceful neighbor, bombarded civilians, and is occupying part of its territory. That's why it's a hot potato. And when it comes to gas, again, the reason why there are tensions in the market of gas, it's because of the Russian invasion.
Yeah. Arunabha, could you?
I think, Jayashree, there is no question, and I've written about this in the Hindustan Times, that we have a technocentrism approach to the whole climate crisis. And as long as technocentrism is our number one sort of in the quiver of arrows, it's the first arrow we pull out, that there'll be a technology fix, we will keep, ending up in some crisis or the other. That does not mean technology does not have a role. Of course it has a role. I mean, without the technology, we wouldn't have had the 172 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. And of course, then technology will also help to increase the generation share. But then you will have other challenges emerging. But look, when we think about net zero, there is net before zero. So there is an element of carbon sequestration and atmospheric carbon removals that will have to be also considered. The question is not just technology versus, say, behavioral change and reducing our own footprints. The question is, what is the model of technology development that we are going to be pursuing? Right? Are we again going to have, at the end of the day, if this is a global commons problem, then are we going to not have a global commons approach towards solving it, especially the really hard parts? Now, if carbon removal or carbon capture, and these will vary, the technologies will vary. Some will be mechanistic, some will be engineered, some will be nature-based solutions, some will be geographically determined. But unless we have a global approach towards this, you're again going to end up in a situation, say 15 years from now, 10 years short of the 2050 global target for net zero. Oh, some countries or some companies have developed a CCS technology or a carbon removal technology, and now how do we finance them, right? So, so again, there is an outflow of finance from the countries where the money should actually be going in. So we need to have a different paradigm that shifts away from this hope for technology transfer towards a paradigm of technology co-development, where we're pooling resources, not just financial, but human and technical, that the geographies that we have are used as laboratories for that development of technology, that the intellectual property is then co-owned, so that we are not monetizing global commons. We can monetize an individual renewable energy project, but monetizing the global commons makes it extremely difficult to get off this technocentrism approach that we've ended up in.
So my final comment on this is that I think what we're talking about, unfortunately, is too theoretical. Okay? We have 5 to 6 years right now towards 2030. What is very clear is that the technologies that are needed to get us to hugely reduced emissions by 2030 already exist. They're on the table. We can do new technology developments, we can do IPRs, we can do all that. But right now, what we need is action between now and 2030. What we actually need is now we need to run rather than even walk the talk. And the technologies exist. I don't think that's even an issue on which even the biggest climate skeptics will disagree on. The question is, why are we not getting the scaling up of the technologies? And the issue there very clearly is, we're not getting scaling up because the finance that is needed for the scaling up is not there. If you look at all data that is coming out actually from the OECD, one of the best reports that has come up now, to show us where is finance going. And finance is still going not where it is most needed, where it should be for making the transformation. It is still going to countries which are high-income countries. It is not going to technologies, to renewable energy, to technologies which exist, which can be scaled up in most of the world. And that's where the whole discussion today, and it is good. I think the world has recognized it. I think President Macron's summit, which has really been led by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, with a huge call of action called the Bridgetown Agenda, really asking for a reform of the global financial architecture, looking at beyond climate finance, about concessional finance. I mean, give you a very clear example, a part of the world that we often write about, as you as journalists write about, which is Pakistan. When you write about the Pakistan floods, as I'm sure many of you did, I'm not sure if we all followed through the fact that there was this huge conference on the Pakistan floods to provide aid to Pakistan for the floods that they had. 88% of the money that was provided to Pakistan was in loans. To a country which is already completely under debt, to provide that finance as loans meant it is meaningless. So I think what we need to now, that is the central question. Why are we not scaling up? Why are we not being able to provide the money? I mean, I'm sure Ambassador is not going to, look at the amount of money that is being pumped into, and I know it's a very, very wrong war. I'm not justifying it. But the fact is, that war is pumping in so much money today from across the world. That money did exist, but it's not coming for climate change. And I think that's where the question of the rule-based system comes in. So let's not talk about the need for new technology. I think let's just keep our eyes on the ball to talk about why aren't we acting at the scale and at the pace that we need to do, given the urgency, the sheer existential threat that climate change has today.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Sumant, could you please?
Yeah, I have somewhat mixed emotions about what both Ranabha and Sunita just said, okay? If you ask me, first of all, the European Union, China, India, and the US account for more than 2/3 of all carbon emissions globally, right? I think it's those geographies in which a lot of the battle has to be fought. It does not have to be fought on the Pakistans of the world. The Pakistans of the world can be a little bit later in the curve, okay?
But only because of the floods and they needed aid.
Okay. Maybe you brought up Pakistan in that context, but certainly I think we have to go a little sequentially. So technology is going to move where it has commercial application. Governments cannot really mandate for technology to go. For example, this whole issue of carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. Some of the largest US fossil fuel companies are investing billions of dollars in that technology. It's not going to become viable unless those investments actually go in and it gets tried at massive scale that these companies are looking at doing. And so therefore, in a way, that technology, once it's developed, is then not just going to move, out of the goodness of its heart. It is going to have to be made to move, and can only be made to move if there's again a commercial model for it. The same thing with finance. Most of the finance that is available in the world today is private finance. That is again not going to move unless there is a good return for it. Or there are certain enabling sort of policy mechanisms put in place for that capital to move, or certain risk mitigations are put in place so that it can go into certain other geographies. So I think I think policymakers therefore have to just look at enabling some of these things rather than actually making it happen. Ultimately, to me, it's in some ways the market, the private sector, the companies that are operating in the space that actually have to find the solutions. And to your question also of CCUS, I think we need all of the above. We need every single solution that we can find. If CCUS works, which I don't know that it does because it seems still to be very expensive, it's a function of what is the cost of storage and how efficient that storage of carbon dioxide is going to be. So the cost is expensive right now. But for fossil fuel companies, it's a great panacea because if it can be made to work, then they can keep mining and taking out fossil fuels and pumping it into society as long as you can now start doing capture of the carbon dioxide that they emit. So for them, it's a great solution. And at COP28, this is apparently one of the big items of conversation that they're going to be bringing up, which is that can we not find these kinds of solutions? And if we can, then hey presto, nothing has to change in the world. We can still carry on doing fossil fuels. But of course, they're only looking at Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. What they're not looking at is, of course, the fact that everybody is going to be burning fossil fuels and running their cars or in running homes and so on. It's hard to capture the carbon dioxide at that individual retail level. Maybe direct air capture solves the problem, but that's even more expensive. So we need massive reduction in those costs of those technologies for it to work out.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for speaking so openly about so many of these issues, which I've always, wondered about, and thought I would discuss with you. Thank you for your time. It was a very enriching discussion. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much.